Okay, welcome to another in the Walk and Talks. This one is going to be about the first settlers of the village and town of Kinderhook, and my name is Sally Naramore. I want to kind of warn everybody, I'm not taking you on a walking tour, so I'm not going to tell you exactly who lived who or when any kind of buildings were built. Instead, I want to kind of place the village of Kinderhook into a context of what's going on in New Netherlands and then New York colony into the early period of American history. So basically we're looking at a 200-year period from 1640 to 1840. And we're starting here because this house happened to be the first parsonage of the Dutch Reformed Church. It had many 19th century additions added onto it, but that's what makes it special, because that's what this talk is about. How did the Dutch culture continue and change through time here in the village of Kinderhook? So with that, let's wander down the street. And we're wandering down a street that we all know as Hudson Street because it connects us to Hudson. It did not connect anything to Hudson at the time. It actually, this part didn't exist. It cut over from the old post road. The old post road in the early days would have connected Claverick to Kinderhook because Hudson itself did not exist as a city or a town. So let's start at the very beginning. Kinderhook is part of what was known as New Netherlands. New Netherlands, of course, was created by the Dutch. The Dutch are a very unique people and a trading people. Commerce was their major living for the majority of the people. They were a conglomeration basically of counties that had freed themselves from Spain in 1584. Almost immediately after that, they developed a globalization policy, meaning that they were going to wait for the truck to pass. Okay. They were globalization. They were trying to expand their economy through trade. Initially, that trade would establish them in the Caribbean, Brazil, and Africa. And then they would turn towards North America later on in this kind of golden age of the Dutch. In 1609, we all know the story that Henry Hudson came up the Hudson River. Henry Hudson, by the way, was British, not Dutch, but he was paid for by the Dutch West Indies Company. They were looking for, again, a Northwest Passage because they were looking for more trade. So what do they develop? They become a global power because they're able to trade raw materials, and the raw material from this area, New York, that they want the most are beavers. Beavers made hats. Hats were one of the major exports of the Dutch. There would also be lots of opportunity for development of the land as farming territory, because this area, as you notice, we are walking down to the creek. This is an alluvial plain, which means that the area around the village here is very fertile, fairly flat. As you get closer to the river, we get a sandy loam, which is extremely good for growing fruit trees. They didn't know that back in the 17th century. What they did see was fertile land around them and creeks. Creeks were important. Creeks give you water power because grist mills and fulling mills were already in existence in technology at the time. So let's backtrack. So when we're talking about Kinderhook, what we're talking about early on is the town of Kinderhook. And the town of Kinderhook is kind of a special place. It's trapped between two larger manors or patroonships. Rensselaerwyck, which is what we would say today is pretty much Rensselaer County, and the Livingston Manor to the south. And there's also, there is another piece of Rensselaerwyck, which is today kind of Claverick area. So this is a pocket of land that was not claimed by any one family or any one group. The Dutch West Indies Company, as we talked about, was into trade. Initially, their goal and why they formed the first settlement at Albany or Fort Orange was to trade furs with the Native Americans that were in the area. After they got caught in a war between the Algonquins and the Iroquois, they moved to Manhattan, what we know today as Manhattan, as the center. But they were still reaching out into this area to get the raw materials that they wanted to trade with. However, they needed some security. They needed to assure that the land was somewhat settled. So they came up with the patroonship system. So if you were a wealthy enough Dutch person And you could ensure the Dutch government that you could fund 50 people to move to an area and farm it, by which you would get rents from it, you could purchase that land. So many second sons of wealthier burghers in the Dutch, this is how they were able to claim land. In the 17th century, land still was the major form of wealth. The more land you had, the more wealth you had. So here was an area available for people to do that. We've now entered William Street, which was known as Cow Lane. And this is actually the original area of the village of Kinderhook. The patent system that we talked about, or patroonship, did not exist in Kinderhook. Instead, it was a series of 13 original proprietors to the area. Some of those names we know today: Schuyler, Van Allen, and Van Alstynes, amongst others, as well as Habsburgs. So they come here, they are mostly Dutch and Swedish, and they're buying tracts of land that are from the Hudson River all the way to Chatham today. So the town of Kinderhook, as it is divided up in the Kinderhook patent, which by the way was not established until 1686, after the British have already taken over New Netherlands, but that area, that's all the town of Kinderhook. So it includes all of modern day Stuyvesant, all of modern day Kinderhook, part of Chatham and part of Ghent. So it's a very large area, and it is mainly agricultural. This street, William Street, was where the original settlers to the village of Kinderhook did. Why? Because over to our right would be the slope down to the creek itself. At this point, the creek has already fallen twice at Falacia and will fall again at Stuyvesant. Where a creek falls is where you have water power. So there's no real water power here. So what the village of Kinderhook in essence becomes at this point on William Street is things to support the farmers. There's harness shops, blacksmiths, and there's a tavern. So those are the kinds of things that we have. In 1714, in the entire, in 1763, there are only 15 houses in this village and one church. Okay, so in 1714, when they first do a count of people living in the town, remembering again how big the town is, there are 143 adults, 150 children, 19 enslaved adults, and 13 enslaved children. Children is anybody below the age of 16 at this time. So let's think about that for a minute. We're not talking about a lot of people, but we are talking about people owning a great deal and large tracts of land. So again, they're going to need a place with a post office because there's some sort of mail connection. They're going to need a place to bring their goods so they can then be transported down to the Hudson River. That means getting them to Claverick and then taking them over the roads to the Hudson, where there would be a bay to move their goods out. So this whole stretch, and you can see this is a very low area of the village, and it curves. You're also seeing that none of these houses date back to the 17th century. Not surprising. Most of what was here were again, shops, stores, that kind of thing. They would have changed over time. I don't believe nearest the creek, they probably didn't have much in the way of buildings. But you can also see that this has always been an area that has been populated over time, and you can tell by the number of buildings here that our population increased over time. And by 1790, so that would be almost 100 years from the first time, there were 4,400 people in the town of Kinderhook. So we're still smallish, but we had grown tremendously at that point. So who are the people that are here? In the village and in the town, they are predominantly of Dutch descent. Remember, the Netherlands is actually a conglomeration of the Low Countries. So some of these people actually are of Flemish descent, might speak Belgium. Some of them are Dutch, like we consider Dutch. The majority of them, though, who come, and there were some Swedish people who came to this area because the Swedes had already explored New Jersey and New York at the same time that the Dutch were doing it as well. So what's interesting about the Dutch is, remember, they are a trading people who go all the way around the world. That is why they were massively involved in the African slave trade. And part of their trade in this area would be slaves from Brazil and the Caribbean up to here. Most of the farmers in the area would have 1 or 2 slaves if they had enough land. Some would have larger numbers. Here, though, is the point where we do see 2 houses that would have come from the earlier period. So, okay. And what's interesting is this shows us the Dutch to English influence. So if you look over here to the right, this house here, it's the stone part that dates back to the early 18th century. The brick wings on it are 19th century. But what's interesting about the brick wings is that they have a combination of English bond and Dutch bond. Over here is the Prine House, which was built in 1766. So let's do some chronological thinking here. The Dutch established New Netherlands in 1624, and it is taken over by the British in 1664. It's a bloodless coup, so to speak, because as far as the Dutch people that were living in New Netherlands, or New Amsterdam, which is now New York, they were very unhappy with Peter Stuyvesant. They had felt that he was not managing the colony well. The Dutch had overextended themselves, and they were making quicker profits from South America, the Caribbean, and Asia than they were making from here. So there wasn't any support militarily, and technically New Netherlands was being run by the Dutch West India Company, not so much the country of the Netherlands. So the people were willing to go under the British Crown because they were able to negotiate a few things. So what would they want to negotiate? Number one, and most importantly, they wanted to maintain the Dutch Reformed Church, or what they simply referred to as the Reformed Church, as the official church of the colony. An official church meant that pew rents and taxes could be given to the church. In the British colonies, that money would normally go to the Anglican Church, or the British Church of England. So England agrees to have 2 supposedly approved churches in the colony. One, the Church of England, and the other one, the Dutch Reformed Church. The other thing that they wanted to continue was their language. Dutch was still a main language and used for a lot of business transactions, and was the first language of most people born throughout the 18th century in Kinderhook. It was Martin Van Buren's first language. So as we look at this house, how does that represent anything? What it represents is this is a Dutch style house in many ways. It is Dutch bond, it's got headers and then stretchers, it's got the crowning over the windows. However, that gambrelled roof, the way it's rounded, is actually an English style. So by 1766, it's fascinating how they'll combine Dutch and English styles. And that kind of is the key to looking at this community, is it's a blending of these cultures. So what do we mean by somebody being Dutch? What would be significant about them in, let's say, the 17th century that would set them apart from a British colonist? Remember, they were a country formed by a group of men getting together, and they were basically a republic. So there's a certain amount of independent spirit in somebody from the Netherlands. Number 2, they are a trading people. They are capitalists. So technically, in the Netherlands, the only church that was approved of was the Reformed Church. And supposedly, people of other faiths, particularly Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, would not have had equal access to things within the legal rights of the New Netherlands. However, that was all kind of not practiced. In other words, nobody stopped anybody from practicing any religion they wanted to in the New Netherlands. There is evidence that there was a mosque in New York back in the 17th century, as well as Catholics, as well as Jews. So it's a very diverse culture, because as long as everybody is working together towards a commerce, that things are forgiven that might not have been as forgiven in another culture. Part of this could be is population. You're talking about a little island nation trying to expand globally. So they have to absorb other people at the same time. So that's kind of the spirit of the people that are here. The majority of the people who came to Kinderhook were Dutch. Even after 1664, it is still very much a Dutch community. In 1686, the Kinderhook patent is legalized. Now, that means that's under the British Crown. And what it basically says is it lays out who are the people who own the property in and around this village. Their laws were under the British Crown, but there were still some customs. The justice of the peace concept that they had had here under the Dutch continues. So it's kind of an interesting combination. So we had just mentioned religion. And as we come up here, this is Maiden Lane. So this is all part of that early part of the village. We know that the village, or there's some evidence that people are living here as early as 1640. It is the early 18th century when you get maps and more clarity as to where the village exists. But up here, we're now on high ground. So as you feel how we're up high, this is the location of where the first Dutch Reformed church was. So the first house we showed you, which is a block up, was the parsonage, and this is actually the location of the first church. The church is the sixth Dutch Reformed church chartered between Albany or Fort Orange and New York City. There's evidence that it could have been formed as early as 1677. It will remain the main church and where the majority of people will belong. So what does it mean that they were Dutch Reformed? The Reformed Church is a Calvinist church. It is not a church with a hierarchy. It is where they believed in individual salvation. That means that the people here read the Bible. Education was important to them because they were to interpret their religion for themselves to a certain degree. There were definitely rules and regulations, but it was much more of an individual idea. That's key, and that's important when we look at this area as we get to the Revolution. That belonged to a church where it was up to the individual to work towards their salvation. It also fits with capitalism, with the idea of we're all going to work to make the money and to take care of ourselves as we need. So there's an independent streak that you might say would have existed. As we come up here, we're now coming into the area of the village that gets established in the 18th century. So why is this changing? It's changing because by 1792, what is now Route 9 will be deeded as a post road from the New York State Assembly. They didn't decide to do that without it already have started to be somewhat of a transportation route. We're also now coming up to the higher ground where the village is slowly but surely moving to. So as we turn down what is known as Sylvester Street, we're going to explore a little bit, how do people in Kinderhook make their living as time goes on? It is still going to be a village that primarily supports the activities of farm culture in the area. However, we also become an area for professionalism, particularly legal lawyers. And that brings us to the house here, which was the house of Peter Sylvester, hence the name of the street. And it is his son Peter who actually, as an attorney, trained some of the most famous legal minds of Kinderhook. So I'm going to stop here for a minute. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you wanted to be a lawyer in the 18th century, how would you go about it? Well, law schools, as we know it, didn't really exist. In fact, it is during this time period from like 1750 on when there is a movement to try and coordinate the professions. And it really won't get finalized until the later mid-19th century. Same thing's happening to medicine. So one of the ways you became a lawyer is you read for, or in essence, apprenticed to a lawyer. Martin Van Buren's father owned a tavern that was down the street we just came up, and he sent his son to grammar schools that were available here. But when the time came that Martin Van Buren wanted to learn the law, the best he could do for him, and what was pretty normal, was to be apprenticed to a particular lawyer. In this case, it was Peter Sylvester. Francis Sylvester. He was kind of what he did. He seemed to have a lot. James Vanderpool was another one of his famous students. Now, let's look at their names. Sylvester, Vanderpool, Van Buren. These are all people of Dutch descent learning British law, and then what would become the American law system, which would be based on the British system. So it's kind of interesting that this is kind of entering what I consider the golden age of the village, which is from the time of the American Revolution to the end of Martin Van Buren's presidency in 1840. The reason for that is this generation, this very interesting generation, who grew up speaking Dutch, many of them, as their first language, and yet would be really the founders of what we would consider our nation. So they have that Dutch culture and Dutch heritage, and yet, and at the same time are being educated in what would be considered more British norms. Not to mention the fact that Martin Van Buren was born after the Revolution, but James Vanderpool and others that were born at the end of the 18th century or the mid, it's still British territory. Remember, it's 1664 when the transfer happens, and yet they're still speaking Dutch. They're still culturally very Dutch. Opposite Peter's house is the other symbol, perhaps, of the other group that is probably the largest of the settlers, and that would be those of English descent. Although, until the 1820s and 30s, the vast majority of people holding anything that resembles a political office in the village of Kinderhook, be it Justice of the Peace or Treasurer, all have Dutch surnames. That doesn't mean that their families haven't intermarried with British and other groups that have come to New York, but that is how kind of Dutch this village will remain. This Episcopal parish was established in 1859. It was one of the many mission churches coming out of Trinity Parish down in New York City, and it was built by Richard Updike, who is the famous architect. Martin Van Buren's son Smith was behind the construction of this church. There is no real evidence that there was a congregation besides this one started maybe in the 1850s. There was a Methodist church or a group of Methodists that would meet starting in the 1830s in Kinderhook, but other than that, it is pretty much a one church town in that time period. And why is that significant? Because until the 1790s, the only language spoken in that church was Dutch. So if you were born in 1700, a British citizen from the beginning, your language at home was Dutch, your language in the church was Dutch. So it allowed the perpetualization of their culture within, which was kind of also rather unique for the British to have allowed that. If you think of New England and its Puritan and its other issues, you think even of Virginia, which is very tied to the Church of England. It was all a very English system, and they were Englishmen. And yet these people considered themselves English citizens, but spoke a different language. So it showed a unique diversity to what New York had, and this village would have been part of that diversity. As we come along, you can see the creek bed rise around there. So again, we're at the high ground that would have turned around onto this spot. Sylvester probably owned most of the land around this area. A lot of the larger houses were on anywhere from 25 to 20 acres within the village of Kinderhook. So people had land attached to their properties. They didn't let the land just be beautiful glowing lawns as much as we would like to think that. They were working farms. They would have anywhere from fruit orchards to farm, to pigs, to cows, to whatever behind their house. You utilize the land. If you were an attorney, for example, you hired people who did that work for you, but the work was still done on your property. So land, even as we enter into the late 18th century, is still the ultimate symbol of wealth and power. Okay. As we turn the corner here, again, these are more modern, meaning 19th century houses, but as we come up, we're coming back into the part of the village that was also here in the 18th century, in this what I've sort of deemed the golden age of the village of Kinderhook. As we approach Route 9, one of the appeal to attorneys to living in Kinderhook was a stagecoach stop on the route between Albany and Hudson. Hudson is chartered as a city in 1786, immediately after, or relatively after, the Revolutionary War, and it very quickly becomes an economic and trading hub. As it becomes the county seat in the early 1800s, instead of Claverack, now Kinderhook becomes even more important as that stopping point between the state government in Albany and the biggest city and trading post in the county, which would be the city of Hudson. So there is a real tie between the two, and as we approach Route 9 and we see all these trucks going back and forth, not that there were trucks in 1782, but there would have been stagecoaches and various wagons going back and forth in front of these properties. By the way, you wanted your house near a main road. That was, again, a sign of wealth and a sign that you were part of the commerce of the area. Okay. Over here to our left is the Dutch Reformed Church. This one was built in the 1860s. But, as I said, the congregation itself is much earlier than that. Looking at the size of the church compared to the size of the church you just saw, you can see that this is still the church that has the larger congregation.
You might almost go around.
Yep.
Just then the sun will be at our back. I'm not sure if it's possible to see it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you're pointing at. Okay. So the residential center of the town has now moved up here for the larger properties, and the first one we're showing you here is that of David Van Schok. I found it interesting, and reading a history of Columbia County from 1873, that this was referred to as the Centennial House. It took me a while to figure out why, and then I realized that it was about 100 years old at the writing of that, because this house was built in 1774. Now you see where the Dutch influence is pretty much gone, that this is very much a Georgian style home, minus the wings. The wings are a 19th century addition. David Van Schok and his brother Peter, who owned the house next door, are very interesting characters in this respect. Who are these men? They're men, their families have been here since the beginning. They have accumulated wealth, they're educated. Peter is a lawyer. And they are involved in the revolutionary process. David Van Schok is on the first committee of correspondence out of New York. He goes to the First Continental Congress. So why didn't you hear about them in your history books? Because when it came to war, they stepped back. And that was sort of a very similar scene throughout Kinderhook. The Dutch in general, that is why 50% or more of the people living in the New York colony were Tories or Loyalists. For the Dutch, they had these people of Dutch descent. Now remember, they've many years since the transfer. But they have not seen themselves as having a bad life under the British, just they object to the taxing because of the French and Indian War, as many colonists did. But they wanted a peaceful resolution. They didn't want, and they didn't have any real problem with having a king or a crown. So when it came to war, they retired back here to Kinderhook to continue their lives as they had known it, and didn't become some of those famous founding fathers that we think of, like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The people from New York State who did that were Alexander Hamilton, Robert Livingston. Livingston was of Dutch descent, but Hamilton, of course, was not. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they kind of reside back up here, and it's very split. Some of the Loyalists go to England at the end of the war and during the war. Some return. Some do not. The majority stay here. Some of them lose their land because they were on, quote, the wrong side of the war. Interestingly enough, Aaron J. Vanderpool eventually purchases this house. As done, well, we backtrack, John Rogers owns this house at the time that he deeds off the land for the Persons of Color Cemetery. So this house goes under a few names, people at that time, although very politically active. So when Aaron J. Vanderpool is here, people like Henry Clay visit, Washington Irving, Thomas Hart Benton, and Aaron Burr were all guests of this house, as was, of course, Burgoyne when he was brought back down from the Battle of Saratoga. Interesting, here's David Van Schaick, who's not exactly a patriot and not exactly a loyalist. So interesting choice to have him be the one to host Burgoyne on their journey back to New York. You could also therefore imagine that as a British officer, your being imprisoned was not a really terrific or horrific experience at all. There was certain, in the revolutionary time period, certain deference given to military officers. One of the
yes.
This is the home of Peter Van Schaick. Peter Van Schaick was David Van Schaick's brother. If you look closely, this is more or less an identical house. You're probably looking at it going, in what way possible? The way to look to see the similarities are the windows and the lintels over each of the windows. This was originally a Georgian house, but this also shows you how people change over time. The people who owned the David Van Schaick house kept it looking, except for the wings on the side, very Georgian. The man who eventually owned this house, James Mix, was an architect from Albany. So he was trying to show that he knew the latest styles and even put an empire style roof on the top of the house, as well as the porch in the front and then the bay window above it. All very Victorian. So what is the point of Peter Van Schaick? How was he like David? Like David Van Schaick, he had been involved in revolutionary issues but did not get involved in the war itself. He did, however, start the first law school in New York State. So where other people would go and just read with a lawyer, Peter Van Schaick actually had it more formalized, took on more pupils at a time, and then would teach them the law. So you can see where we were talking about earlier, this development of the concept of professionalism or professional schools. He's one of the leading lights on it. It also shows you how critical and how important Kinderhook was to the legal profession. That this is like Litchfield, Connecticut is another place that had one of the earliest law schools. They are centers for law. In Kinderhook's case, could be two reasons. One, and most importantly, proximity to the state capital, proximity to Hudson, that there would get you to the Hudson River, to New York City. The other issue is all of these land patents that had existed, that had tenant farmers on them, were now being disputed as we go into the New Nation period. So a lot of work for lawyers in this area. And it's also, in many ways, interesting because the Dutch descendants of those early Dutch people are the ones who go to the law in large numbers. So as we move down here, we'll show you the symbolism of Kinderhook in the new nation. There's a lot of federal houses along the side. This route, most of these houses, or a lot of these houses, were built between 1790 and 1825. Aaron Vanderpool lived in the house over there, as well as there are Italianate houses put in between. Sometimes the houses in between were built for the children of the people who lived in the house next door. That was a common thing to do. And that is an old practice. If we go all the way back to that first house I showed you, built in 1766, that had the Dutch and the gambreled roof on it, that was built as a gift for a son upon his wedding. That's why it has a heart in the brick. So it's not surprising that this house here was also built for that purpose. All right. So if we were going to look at the symbol, remember again, I'm looking at this time period from after the American Revolution to 1840 is kind of the golden age for the village of Kinderhook. And this house is probably the best symbol of it. And this is the house of James Vanderpool. There were several Vanderpool brothers. The Vanderpools were early settlers to the town of Kinderhook. James Vanderpool was an attorney, as was his brother Aaron J. And again, he establishes his house right here on the post road. James Vanderpool's house included 20 acres to the back. That's what's interesting about these properties. They go back and become farmland. He had peach trees and apple trees on the property. Not surprising, because as you walk back behind the Vanderpool house, you see some mascots, which is our orchard today. So again, this land was well used for that purpose. This house is not Georgian, but federal. And it has a lot of American symbolism in it. You know, when you can focus in on that eagle above the door, the pineapple, which is a symbol of hospitality. There are more, symbols of the new nation in the house itself. Very clean lines, very even, symmetrical. That was part of the focus of that time period. Vanderpool made his money mostly in doing a lot of law work for farmers in the area. Again, disputes over land usage, disputes over whether or not they still needed to pay quick rents. The manor system had been overthrown with the new New York state government. Many of these people couldn't pay Vanderpool in cash, so they paid him in land. So even in 1815, 1820, your value is still in how much land and property you might own. And he's a good example of that. Vanderpool eventually goes up and is in the circuit court system and moves to Albany. He lived over on Elk Street. So he leaves here in the late 1820s. So this is a good example of, he's part of that generation though, like Martin Van Buren and like his brother who eventually comes back to Kinderhook. These were all men raised in the Dutch Reformed Church, raised in a certain Dutch culture, who embrace this new nation. They're too young or not even born yet during the American Revolution. So they kind of embrace this concept of a new nation and become a very important part of it. Not surprising if we look back to that Dutch culture of the concept of individualism, of making your own decisions. A democracy fits with that. Okay. As we go into the center of the village, this is where the action, so to speak, turned to in the early 19th century. So at the time when Martin Van Buren is rising to fame politically as a senator and in Congress, and of course as really the architect of the Democratic Party with Andrew Jackson, this part of the village, this becomes the center of the village. There had been a cemetery that was in the center of the village all the way down pretty much to where the village hall is today. That cemetery was picked up and moved down Albany Avenue in 1817, 1 year after John Rogers had deeded the property over for the cemetery for the people of color, which is kind of interesting. It is also interesting that Martin Van Buren's wife dies in 1819, so she's one of the first people interned in the new cemetery. So what did this area look like? Well, it didn't look like this because we had a major fire in the 1880s that burned down most of the buildings. However, this was an area that had taverns because, again, this is the stage route. There was a post office, there was a general store, and there were 2 banks. And before we move on to the story of the banks, if you look at this little white building on the corner here, which some of us remember as a drugstore long ago, that was actually built by John Rogers in 1821. It was kind of what you would call today a general store. It also had the post office in it. John Rogers is a very important person in the village of Kinderhook, and he is not Dutch. He's actually an Irish immigrant. So you will see by 1800, the diversity of people in the village will start to change. But that true diversity won't really hit until we get into the mid-19th century. I said before there were 2 banks in Kinderhook, and the banks kind of reflect the political feeling of this area. The first bank was known as the National Bank of Kinderhook, not to be confused with the one we know today. It was established in 1839, which would have been after the Panic of 1837, when there was a push towards, it was a state chartered as a state bank, not as a national bank. And it was established and on its first board of directors was a man by the name of Mordecai Myers. He was an attorney. He was also of the Jewish faith. So again, we have a little bit of change of diversity as we go into the 19th century. This bank here, the National Union Bank of Kinderhook, is actually established in 1853. And in 1859, this building is built and they move into it in the 1863. Interesting, it was built initially as a house. The bank had suffered a fire, and so they wanted a more secure building, so they purchased this, put a massive safe in the middle of it, and were able to create the bank. Now, how do these banks reflect politics in Kinderhook? This is the National Union Bank of Kinderhook, which is established as the National Union Bank in 1865. That's the end of the Civil War. Remember I said we had this sort of period of what I call the golden years of the village of Kinderhook that go up until 1840. That time period, particularly between 1800 and 1840, is the time of James Vanderpool of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, as we know, replaced Andrew Jackson in 1836 and then suffered from the Panic of 1837, which is actually caused by Jackson and destroying the bank. But Martin Van Buren did nothing to overturn Jackson's original policies. The economic downturn is usually a way for a president to lose a second term, which it was for Martin Van Buren. But there was another reason as well. He had at that point determined that he did not approve of the Democratic Party's approval of the spread of slavery to the territories. Martin Van Buren is going to be one that will eventually create the Free Soil Party. This then is how you connect this to the National Union Bank. Kinderhook, which might have been split during the Revolution, was not split during the Civil War. That this area was very much a unionist area and one that would have promoted that. Being a National Union Bank meant that you would supply greenbacks from the federal government. So interestingly enough, as you turn this way to the other side, although this building is newer, we know there was a steam-powered cotton mill in the village, and I would suspect it was in this area. That is the first mill or factory that you see in the village of Kinderhook. This is why the village of Kinderhook after 1840 will start to not be in its golden age. As more and more manufacturing develops in the county, Kinderhook is not part of that development. That development will be in Stuyvesant and will be in Volusia. Why? Because they have the water power necessary. So there will be a textile mill in Volusia as early as 1815 because they don't need external power, meaning steam or something like that, to create or allow machines to work. In the parking lot was the Kinderhook Hotel. The original hotel was up by 1830. It is where Martin Van Buren gives his last speech when he comes back to retire. Henry Clay gave a speech there in 1840. So you can see by Martin Van Buren being here in Kinderhook, very important people in politics of the country during this sort of fateful antebellum period were often gravitated to this small little village, which even at that time had at most 1,200 residents. So with that, what would be our final look at for the Dutch legacy, so to speak, which is what we started off. The political figures up and through until this period of 1840 were a majority of Dutch or Swedish descent. It is no mistake that Martin van Buren is of Dutch descent. The Dutch Reformed Church remained predominant and continued to use Dutch in their services through the early part of the 19th century, did not even introduce English until the 1790s. However, the English who moved here, because English did move over time, did not impress or influence these people. We can see that in the study of law, we can see that in the architecture. By 1840, Kinderhook in some ways would represent and look like the town that Rip Van Winkle came back to see. A town that still had some semblances of what Rip Van Winkle had known as being Dutch, but had changed and woken up from its sleep.